Tonight on Stuff We Say, I'm joined by G from G to the Next Level as we talk about the Nokia NGage, a strange cross between an old cell phone and a handheld game console that was perhaps a bit too far ahead of its time. Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Stuff We Say podcast. As always, my name is James and I'm your host, and joining us once again is...
G from G to the Next Level. Hey there, how y'all doing today?
How are you doing, man? It's great to have you back on here.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me on, man. I'm doing excellent. It's nice and chilly down here in Houston for once, but you know what? I'm ready to kick this podcast up.
Today, we're talking about one of the absolute weirdest gaming platforms to ever be released, the Nokia NGage. This thing was incredibly forward-thinking. If you enjoy playing games on your phone that are more, complex than the likes of Snake, then you can thank this thing. It was incredible. It could play games off cartridges. It was on par, what would you say, with the PlayStation 1 in terms of power?
I'd say really between the PlayStation 1 and the Game Boy Advance. It seemed to be kind of that nice little meaty middle between those two. And I think that's really where Nokia was trying to combat against, because I think that's what their competition was at the time when it came out, was the Game Boy Advance, right?
Absolutely. And, it was incredibly innovative and had some great ideas, and that didn't stop it from being just dreadful to actually game on. But we'll get to that in a bit. So... First off, let's talk about how we first learned about the N-Gage. Would you like to go first?
Sure, I'll go first. So when I learned about the N-Gage, at the time I was working for Funkoland, which is now known as GameStop. So we were talking about different gaming consoles that were actually coming in, and my boss at the time got a press kit for the Nokia NGage, and she's like, "What is this?" So it was because at that time it's we didn't really have full scale games on phones. I mean, there weren't really such things as smartphones yet, and so
this was 2003, I should mention.
Right. So that's that wasn't really quite there yet. So my thing was just that I was always kind of intrigued because I had just got my first kind of my first phone at the time, and it's just I can play games on my phone and I can actually talk on the phone too. But I was but nah, you know what? I don't need it. I got a Game Boy. It's too expensive. I don't really want it. So how I got mine was actually really awesome because I was a big fan of Adult Swim. So I was watching, the shows on Adult Swim and whatnot. AdultSwim.com actually had a giveaway for a free N-Gage and a prize party pack, and I won. So I won a free N-Gage because of that, and that's about as much as I would have liked to have spent on that system.
You spent nothing, and you had no expectations, and were they met?
I'd have to say, with no expectations, it flew with flying colors. I'd say so. With no expectations. That's the best I could say about it, really. Now, I mean, and I know I'm selling it short a little bit. There are some, which I know we're probably going to talk about. Mm-hmm. There are some actually quite good games for the Nokia NGage that often get overlooked.
Oh, absolutely. And it's interesting because library-wise, it really did fit into that, kind of sweet spot between the Game Boy Advance and the PlayStation 1, though I think I say that in part because a lot of the games that it got were just ports from those platforms.
Right. They're either ports of that or there are ports of other mobile-style games, too. Yeah. But there were some original ones, too.
And I guess it's funny because, the N-Gage is a system I've always heard about, and I was weirdly intrigued because I was before I could play Sonic CD on my Samsung Galaxy, I guess I could have played Sonic N for the N-Gage, which was just a worse version of Sonic Advance, but
yep.
It's weird because I was not expecting to get mine when I got mine. A local game store got an old Commodore VIC-20 computer, and which is awesome. It's old, it's from the 80s, it's retro tech, it's everything that I love, and that makes people question my sanity. But when I went in, was looking at it, I was well, I don't know. It's also I see you got this N-Gage in here, and that's cool, and that's something that maybe at some point I'll cover on YouTube or, I guess, in a podcast. But I don't know if I want it. And I'm not going to give the exact price, but I ended up walking out of there with the VIC-20 and all the stuff they had for that, and the N-Gage and all the games they had for it.
Excellent.
It was something I was really intrigued by. And I say intrigued, but that's probably not the right term. I think morbidly curious describes it better.
That sounds very accurate.
So, going over the history of this was announced by Nokia in 2002. They were known for their phones. The Nokia 3310, which was an absolute brick of an old cell phone, has become a meme. But this thing was announced in 2002. Why? Because they weren't happy just being a major player in the cell phone market. They wanted to take on Nintendo and the Game Boy Advance. So this thing was launched in 2003, 2 years after the Game Boy Advance, and was followed with an updated version the following year called the Nokia NGage QD. And what's nice about having you on here, dude, is I have the original N-Gage, but you actually have the QD, and it's a different experience really between the two.
Absolutely. Well, because a lot of it is architecturally done because the way that the original N-Gage is designed has two main flaws about it. And the first one is that if you want to change cartridges, you have to completely remove the battery. The cartridge slot is underneath it. And then the second one is that because of the way that the microphone is positioned and designed, that's why they call it the taco, because you have to talk to it from the side. And it's really, really strange. But the QD, to me, it's like the QD is a little bit smaller. It's a little bit thicker than the original N-Gage install. It's got like a strange sort of rubber band around the outside, a little rubber grip that has a hook. And you could easily hot swap cartridges. And to me, it was a lot more comfortable. The D-pad also felt a little bit better. And I don't think it had any enhancements in the screen or anything like that. But to me, it just felt a little bit better. So I was like, hey, awesome. That's the one that I want. So I was like, I'm cool with that. But I guess wise how the game plays, the games still pretty much play the same.
Yeah, and the oddest thing about the N-Gage, I say this actually holding my N-Gage in my hands right now, is if we aren't talking about the buttons or anything, the original taco style N-Gage is actually remarkably comfortable to hold in the hands.
Yeah.
You know, it has that curve on the bottom, makes it kind of conform well, and the only thing that's weird is with how your fingers rest on the top, it kind of almost feels like they were planning to put L or R buttons on it, like on the Game Boy, which they didn't.
Yeah, maybe so.
Yeah.
What do you think with a 9 key, with a 9 key or 10 key? I guess with like a 10 key keypad next to it. And I don't know if maybe they felt like, oh, I guess we don't have to do that. We've got the buttons there, but
I feel like that's the biggest downfall of it, though. The one thing that I think about that's rather controversial is I've never used a QD, but I think the original N-Gage actually has a pretty decent D-pad. It's definitely not as good as the Game Boy Advance or even the PSP, which came out a few years later. It's rather small, but it's not a bad D-pad. It feels good. And also, it has, like, whenever you press a direction, it gives you this very almost audible click.
Yes.
And it's a click that you definitely, and it reminds me almost like playing on one of the old Neo Geo Pocket handhelds.
I was just about to say that.
Yeah, you know, it feels remarkably good because despite the weird shape, you get that really good feedback, and it's a shame that the actual buttons aren't the same. Instead of giving it a traditional A and B button, what they did is you have a traditional cell phone style keypad, which I guess actually technically a 12 key
right
numpad, since you know you also have asterisk and pound sign. I almost called it a hashtag. But
Me too. What an age we live in, right?
I know, right? Like, and with that, any boomers that were listening have turned off the podcast. But but instead of giving it a proper A and B button, they just made the 5 and 7 keys act as A and B buttons, and they feel exactly the same as all the other neighboring buttons.
Right.
And I find that, along with just not feeling good, you know, like it reminds me of back when Hurricane Ike hit Texas. One of my memories was playing Tetris on an old flip phone that I had at the time, and it kind of reminds me of that. You know, the buttons, they don't feel like game console buttons; they feel like old cell phone buttons. And because it's these two specific buttons that you have to hit, but because they're still, you know, they aren't raised up or lowered compared to the other ones, I find myself constantly hitting other buttons on the numpad whenever I try to play something.
Yep, me too.
Is that still an issue on the QD?
Oh, totally. Because from what I gathered on the original and the QD, I don't really see any sort of main difference in how the buttons feel. Because I feel your pain there, because I did the exact same thing, especially because since it's the 5 number and the 7 number, so they're angled upwise, but they're not at like the same angle as, say, like a Genesis button pad or Game Gear pad or the Dogbone NES controller. So they're
Right.
almost at a what can I say? I guess at a strange angle to where, yeah, it's easy to make that mistake, especially if you're used to playing on the Game Boy. You probably think 4 and 5 are your buttons, but no, they're not.
You know, it's a shame too because there's a lot of good ideas here. Like the OS on the phone is super easy to navigate. You know, it's
yeah.
very
That's
very
Symbian
much so.
OS.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much so just an OS that you'd find on any old Nokia phone from the time. But it works. The only thing I think's any different is that, it has a launch game option that, the games are cool because it came on essentially SD
Yep.
cards that were, but I don't know. Well, first off, I think there's something to be said for the build quality because we both have issues with both of our N-Gages where unless you really force a cartridge into it, and sometimes like, even after like cleaning the cartridge slot with like isopropyl alcohol and whatnot, it feels like it can only get a game working on it 1 in every 10 times. That's not. Should I tell the story of why I got mine for so cheap as well? Like, along with getting it with the VIC-20?
I don't see why not.
The Nokia NGage will not even turn on unless you have a SIM card in it. It will just boot up to a blank screen and then turn off. So the store, they couldn't even they couldn't even test it. And, of course, I'm not going to throw a SIM card into an old phone. So what I found out is there's a supplier in Texas who had a whole bunch of dummy SIM cards. Because apparently when Nokia released the QD, just so you could actually turn it on without a phone plan, they would include a fake SIM card with them, just so you could, trick the system into booting up.
Yep.
And I somehow got one of those, along with a dubiously legal CD containing all of the games from this provider, which, okay. But I wasn't expecting it, but okay. So the store, was like, we can't test this. And, we don't want to go out and buy a phone plan just to test the system we had brought in. And it's weird because, once you have it in, it works fine. It works decently enough for an old, over 15-year-old cell phone, but it's odd.
Yeah. No, I can tell you one other thing with the QD. One of the issue I had with it is that, well, what's even cooler about the one that I got from AdultSwim.com is that it actually came unlocked.
Oh, that's nice.
So it's just like you still have to put a SIM card in there, but it could be just like a deactivated SIM from AT&T and T-Mobile, which I have plenty of, and then just pop it in there and then it works fine. But the other issue that I have with the QD is that, remember that plastic rubber ring that I talked about?
Yes.
Over time, it would wilt away. And I mean, like, by over time, I mean, not very long. So I'd have to replace that rubber ring. And guess what's on the rubber ring? The power button.
Oh, no.
So basically, I'd have to pop it out and then just kind of jam my thumb to turn the thing on and off, unless if I just remove the battery. So that's kind of a bummer. But I know one thing I love about the N-Gage too is that it basically was my first MP3 player, because
because
the MP3 player was great.
Was it your daily driver phone?
I'd say so. Well, driver/bus riding, because I didn't always have a car.
Yeah.
I had to share a car, so I didn't always have my car. But yeah, it was a really good MP3 player as a multimedia device, because it had that. It had Bluetooth capability, which was also something that was kind of ahead of its time. The system itself, as a phone, I will stand to the end of the earth that as a phone that came out in 2002, 2003, aside from having to talk on the original model weird, it was way ahead of its time. It was an excellent phone. I will give it that. Fantastic phone. I loved mine. As a game system, it was kind of hit or miss, but as a phone, it was excellent.
And it was incredibly forward thinking, just looking at it now, because this is something that I don't really remember seeing till probably well after the PS3 came out, was it actually has a mini USB connection on it. So you can hook it up to a PC. I said, so, specs wise, oddly impressive, but you've said it was an excellent phone. And how long did you use your QD for?
I used mine for about 3 or 4 years, like actually as a phone. I think I used it. Yeah, I used it for about that long. Yeah, and I had a great time with it. The only reason why I upgraded was because I got a smartphone.
And it's odd because it has a lot of features nowadays that make it seem like a proto smartphone.
Oh yeah.
It's a shame because had they gone for a widescreen instead of like a cell phone style vertical screen,
right?
But also, had they maybe released the QD, not even the original, just released the QD a few years later after the iPhone came out, I think they could have actually done something really cool with this.
I agree. I think so. I think that if the QD or the N-Gage had done well enough, that Nokia would have stuck around. To me, either the next model that would have come out or maybe the generation after that, I think it probably would have been a really good killer alternative, because it's tough to go up against Android and iOS now. It's really tough to go up against that. And even Sony tried with PlayStation Portable, which I thought was pretty impressive. But think about it. If you really, really think about it, where would mobile gaming be without the N-Gage? And the N-Gage was really the first step out.
And it's kind of crazy to think about because it's playing games, I think, some of which I think would still look pretty decent on modern phones, if not for the aspect ratio. Like, playing, what was it, Rayman 3D was on there?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
Rayman 3.
Sega Rally looks great. It's a shame that one's so rare that's $1,000 game nowadays, but apparently, looking at my cheat sheet, they did actually announce a console called the N-Gage 2.0 that was supposed to come out in 2007. But then, because this one it sold fairly poorly, they sold 3 million N-Gages within the first three years or so, apparently.
Okay.
But because it did not meet their targets, they just kind of axed the 2.0, which is a shame because I think they really could have given the iPhone a run for their money had they actually continued to improve on the design.
I think so. But you know what they say, when you're first in technology, it's always kind of tough because once your competitors get out there and do what you could do better, it's always kind of tough to play catch up on that. I mean, heck, Sega probably is the biggest shining example of that.
Oh, absolutely! Like Phantasy Star Online on the Dreamcast, and the Dreamcast had a built-in modem on it, didn't it?
Yes, it had a built-in dial-up, and they were the first, or I believe they were the first console to come through with a broadband adapter that you can actually play with a broadband connection. Because then I believe so, because the PS2 was after that.
Yeah, and within 2 years they left the console business, but that's a story for another time. But,
of course.
But the N-Gage, I feel like, was, though I don't think it hurt Nokia nearly as badly as the Dreamcast hurt Sega, even though it's not great to play games on, it's kind of sad to see how it ultimately turned out. Which, should we talk about the actual gameplay experience? We've already complained about the buttons on it. I think the screen's worth complaining about as well.
Oh, absolutely. And my biggest problem with it is that I thought that the screen was nice and bright. I mean, the colors are pretty vibrant on it. I mean, looking at it from viewing angles, again, I thought it was pretty decent. But the biggest problem is the fact that it's a vertical screen. That it's not square, it's not rectangle. It's just basically, I think it's a 2.3 inch screen. I believe it's 2.3 inches. But yeah, a vertical 2.3 inch screen. Now, if you think about it, if you're playing something like let's use Sonic N as an example. Again, you're playing Sonic N, which is a port of Sonic Advance from Game Boy Advance. Trying to play a Sonic game on a vertical portrait screen, there's a reason why when you play the Sonic mobile games, it forces you to play it in landscape mode because it's really hard to see. How can you go fast when you can barely see 2 feet in front of you?
And to be fair, they did try to get around that. There are 2 viewing modes for Sonic N.
Right, but it squishes the screen though. Like even more so.
On the N-Gage, Sonic Advance, instead of running, you could either have it run and you could see the full field of view like you could in Sonic Advance, but it'd be squished down and you'd have borders.
Right.
Or you could have it take up the entire screen, but you'd only be able to see 2 feet in front of Sonic. And to quote the Blue Hedgehog himself, that's no good.
Nah. Not at all. And it's a shame too, because if you look at that now, I know you mentioned Rayman earlier, because like Rayman is an example, because I mean it was a side scroller, but I guess because of the pacing of Rayman and how it's done, it felt okay, even though it was done vertically.
Right. And there's ways they could have done Sonic. Like what's odd is that even though I feel like 3D games can be problematic, like the Call of Duty game on N-Gage is awful.
I never played it.
It's a shame because this from that earlier of Call of Duty where it was actually before it just became something where it's every year it's the same old thing.
Right.
Back then it was actually a really great little series of military first person shooters back then.
Yeah.
And I forget if it's the first or second game that's on the N-Gage, but I've tried playing it and it's just awful. Not because of viewing angles or anything, but because the frame rate is just it craps itself.
It is the first one. You're right, and that's a good point to bring out. Is that most of the games that try to do like a first person perspective or try to be like overly ambitious with polygonal graphics, they tend to chug like really, really badly. Another one, Splinter Cell Chaos Theory. That's a perfect example. I have it. I actually got this one way back in the day because I was a big fan of Splinter Cell, like back in the Xbox days. But maybe it runs at like 10 frames per second. If even that, like sometimes it just chugs so badly to where it's completely unplayable. But then there are some that are fully polygonal, excuse me. Like there's some that are fully polygonal, like the SSX game for it, which the SSX game was great. I thought it played very well.
And I'd go as far to argue that the vertical screen isn't as bad for 3D games as it is for 2D games.
I agree.
And I think part of that might be because of how the camera works. In a 2D game, you usually just have that fixed camera angle. In a 3D game, it doesn't affect things as much because you can usually turn the camera somehow.
Right.
Of course, on the N-Gage, where you're having to, finagle with cell phone style number key buttons, that can be easier said than done, but it's at least something where an attempt can be made with.
Right. Oh no, I agree. That's like this. There's one game on the N-Gage, and this is actually, in my opinion, is one of the best games on the system. It's a racing game called Glimmerati. And have you ever heard of that one?
No, I've never heard of it.
It's great. It's basically like I could say it's something more like a Need for Speed style game, but it's not. It's 3D, but it's top down 3D, and something like
Like a Micro Machines?
Yeah, sort of like a Micro Machine style game, and it runs really smoothly. Like you're talking about, because the game is fixed for the phone's vertical screen, it feels right. And it's a game I'm just like, this game is still very impressive even today. Like if Bugbear were to make a port for this for like a modern console, I'd play it.
Do you think then that a lot of the N-Gage's problems came from most of its library being ports from other systems instead of games that were actually built for it?
I think that probably is a chunk of its problem. And that really comes to whenever you're making a game system that the majority of your library is that, because then at that point you don't really have much of an identity. But I can't really say that because Nokia did have a handful of their own games. Like they had Pathway to Glory, they had the Glimmerati, like I mentioned, Requiem to Hell. That was really good. It's like a gauntlet style game. Operation Shadow was a good game. I think there are some that actually were pretty good. In fact, even Sega made a couple of original games for it too, like this one, Pocket Kingdom. Like this one, I remember this one was really fun. Well, you had to play online. It was basically an MMO style game that's supposed to be a prequel or a spiritual. No, I'm sorry. It's basically like kind of a spiritual successor to Dragon Force on the Saturn.
Oh, cool.
But what's interesting about it is that when you're talking to your enemies, you're facing off, they speak in like early 2000s leet speak. So it's like, oh, I'm going to wreck you up, you noob. I'm like, oh, Lord. Yeah,
Oh,
get
God.
wrecked. Like, what?
It's
what?
aged poorly in the best possible way.
Looking at the back of the box, it's just like the dialogue says, like, I read about this on the message boards, and somebody says this, I'm about to bust a cap up in this piece. No. Bad game. Good game.
Oh, God.
Legit, the game actually is good.
You killed me. Did you say that one's online only?
It was online. Well, no, there is an offline mode too, but it was mainly geared for online. I remember I did play it online.
I need it now. It sounds amazing. In the worst possible ways.
Well, if you can't find it, bring your N-Gage with you when you come down and you can play it. I have it.
Oh, that's amazing.
N-Gage Arena.
Pocket Kingdom.
That's what it was. It's called the N-Gage Arena when you play it online. I was trying to remember
N-Gage
the name.
Arena. And it's kind of funny as well because, I guess I was right around the time that Xbox Live first became a thing on the original Xbox as well. Like, thinking back to that era in handhelds, even though this one had its issues, I do think the issues didn't the actual design issues weren't enough to stop it against the Game Boy Advance. Why do I say that? Because the original Game Boy Advance had the worst screen I've ever seen on any handheld ever. And it was odd because the original Game Boy didn't have a backlight screen, but that was 1989. So I guess, people excused it. I don't know. It was before I was born.
I think people were a lot more accepting to that because it was black and white, though. Like, once you got into color, then it's like, okay, maybe you guys might want to put a backlight in this, but I guess Game Boy Color was still okay with it. But with Game Boy Advance, you're absolutely right. Like, I love the Game Boy Advance. It's my favorite Nintendo portable system. And I remember slogging through the original Game Boy Advance because I loved it so much. But that screen was just like, no. But then when the SP came out, I was like, bravo. This is what I've been wanting.
If you love Nintendo games, want to play Game Boy Advance games, just completely count out the original model. Like, it has a great form factor, but the screen is even darker than the original screen. Like, to see the games properly, you literally need to be standing on the surface of the sun.
Right.
Which is even weirder since, a few years prior, Nintendo had released the Game Boy Light only in Japan, which had a front light on it. But, getting back on topic, what I'm saying is that the Game Boy Advance, though I think it better feeling in the hand, had its own issues I don't think it made the N-Gage completely unviable.
I think so, but it's always tough to go up against the Nintendo juggernaut when it comes to portables. It's an admirable effort that Nokia did, and they really did try it, because how long did the system last before it was discontinued? I think it was before it was actually...
until... Okay, so I'm seeing conflicting things checking my cheat sheet. They officially stopped selling them in 2005, but it doesn't like there is actually any like it was actually officially discontinued until 2007 when they also axed the N-Gage 2.0.
Okay, so it only lasted really about 3 years?
only about 3 years, technically
Mm.
5. And it's a shame, too, because they did an admirable effort. 3 million units, isn't a lot compared to, say, like, over 100 million units of, say, PlayStation 2s or Wii's that were eventually shipped. But that's still 3 million of these little things.
Oh, yeah.
Do you think it was something to do with marketing? The fact that it was a video game console you had to buy from a cell phone store, or the fact that it lacked a killer app like a Sonic or a Mario or a Crash Bandicoot?
I think it was a little bit of both, to be honest, because it's like, yeah, with any game system, you have to have, I'm not going to say you have to have a mascot, but you do have to have at least some sort of killer app to get people coming. And I think Nokia's biggest thing was the fact that it was early online play. But when you can tout that you have early online play, but most of the games are only meh to with a few gems here and there, that, yeah, I think that's what did it in. Because if I remember well, I remember seeing a lot of advertising for it. So I don't really think that was a lack of marketing. I think it was, and you could kind of tell what audience they were going for. And like they were going mainly for the same audience that Sega was going for. So that sort of like, late teen, like early 20s kind of vibe. Like, they were like the new attitude kid on the block. So I don't really think it was the advertising. I think the biggest thing really was, as you said, the fact that you basically had to either get it directly from a mobile carrier and you had to have a plan, because this was back in the day when you really couldn't just go buy a phone directly from them, or buy it directly from Nokia themselves. And I can't remember exactly how much it was, but I remember it being expensive.
And then the honest thing is, you said your manager at GameStop or Funko Land at the time got one of those.
Right.
So did GameStop carry, or it was what I was transitioning. I even saw, this was back when you could still find EB games in the States as well, even though GameStop had already bought them.
Right.
Did GameStop sell the games for them, or were they just kind of like, hey, this is a new system that's out and you're video game people? Because I don't remember.
Oh, no, they totally sold the games for it.
Just not the systems?
Like, absolutely. They sold the games and they sold the accessories. They sold the systems at full price, though. They were one of the few ways you could actually get the system at full price. If you got it from like an AT&T store, I think it was T-Mobile, if I'm not mistaken. If you got it from a T-Mobile store, then you had to sign up for a plan, and then it was done in the same vein where it's like a 2-year contract. So yeah, not cheap.
And it's kind of odd, that they'd go that they'd actually make you, have to have a SIM card for it to boot. And I think that might be why with the QD they started shipping fake SIM cards with them.
Yep, I think it's because it's a phone first and a game system second, which I think that was probably one of the things, because it makes you wonder if they marketed it more to be a phone with a cutting edge online game system versus being a cutting edge online game system. Oh, by the way, that's also a phone. Maybe it would have done better because, like I said, as a phone, it's excellent, or at the time, it's excellent. So it makes me wonder if maybe they had catered more to the phone market with additional games versus catering to the game scene with an additional phone.
I think that's kind of why I feel the way I do now about it, right? Which is, if they'd actually put out that 2.0 and stopped trying to compete with Nintendo, they could have potentially crushed Apple, especially since they were still one of the biggest phone manufacturers at the time.
Oh, yeah.
But then again, this could just be me speculating about cool, weird things. I definitely see that Sega parallel as well, Do you think that if Sega hadn't left the console market, and if the Dreamcast, or even if the Game Gear had been successful enough to get a successor, that Nokia wouldn't have seen a need to make something like the N-Gage?
Maybe, because if you really think about it, I mean, one of the biggest third-party companies to support the N-Gage was Sega. So I'm not sure. It also makes you wonder if maybe, kind of like how like Nintendo and Sony were working on the PlayStation together. It really makes you wonder if maybe through some sort of parallel time, maybe this could have been a Sega smartphone. It might have been.
I feel the N-Gage was very much so ahead of its time.
It was.
Are there any other standout games?
Oh, well, as far as other standout games go, I can say another shockingly good one was the port of Pandemonium. I think that was like one of the first games that a lot of people got for it. Are you familiar with Pandemonium? It was a PlayStation 1 and Saturn game. It was also known as Magical Hoppers. I think that's the other name for it. It's a 2.5D like action platformer, kind of like Klonoa. but this was pre-Klonoa, and that got a really good port on there. There's a port of King of Fighters called King of Fighters Extreme that actually wound up being pretty. Yeah, it's decent. It feels. You were talking about that D-pad before.
Yeah.
It's like that's a perfect example of how that D-pad actually worked really well. There was a Ghost Recon game for it that I thought was all right. I know that for those who are into wrestling, which is interesting, WWE Aftershock was actually quite good.
No kidding.
And I was like, that was quite good on it. But I think those were the main extent of the games that I've played for. Like I said, Pocket Kingdom was a lot of fun. Crash Nitro Kart was an interesting one. I just got that one recently, and it's like it's interesting.
Yeah, apparently Tomb Raider is on it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I have the Tomb Raider game for it. That's another one that, again, ambitious, but when you have too much ambition like that, it's kind of dangerous. It's okay. It's okay. It's like we tried.
The one thing I really want to try is there was also a version of Super Monkey Ball for it.
Yes, I'm looking for that.
It's a shame because some of with the exception of Sonic, it seems like most of the Sega stuff's actually kind of hard to find for it.
It's starting to be. I have noticed that. I think I have all of them. I believe Monkey Ball is the only one that I'm missing. Like I think I have all of the other Sega games for it because Alien Front was canceled. And there was supposed to be a Virtual Cop game for it too, and it also got canceled. And then I guess technically Sega Rally, but yeah, I'm never gonna get that.
And of course, for all of y'all out there who are big fans of the Elder Scrolls and need something to play, but while you wait for Bethesda to release another version of Skyrim, there was an exclusive Elder Scrolls game made for the N-Gage, Shadowkey.
That game's pricey now.
Gameplay I've seen from it looks cool. I don't know if it actually played well.
I don't know either. I never got a chance to try it.
But it's out there. It exists. Hopefully this is information that's helped someone and hopefully made their day. Like, I just love how cool and weird and not even unnecessary. I think this was a crucial first step towards what we now see as smartphones.
Although you could argue that some smartphones are indeed fart phones.
They made an admirable attempt, and I think that's what we're getting after. So, any final thoughts before we end off?
Yeah, I think just really with the N-Gage, it's just I can really see it as a little engine that could. And I've always been a big fan of charming stories when it comes to game consoles that don't really get the love and the respect that they really do deserve, or ones that maybe were just so incredibly ahead of their time, but were just victims of bad circumstances, like in the case of the Dreamcast, or maybe like the TurboGrafx because you couldn't really find it in certain markets. The N-Gage, I could really throw it into something like that too. It's just that if you give it a chance, there are some really good gems on the system. Now, I understand it's one of those things that most of the games are fairly inexpensive, but they're just kind of tough to find. That's the hard thing. It's like a lot of it you'll probably have to wind up getting online, but there are some really good gems for it. But yeah, I think as far as the mark that it left on the world, unfortunately isn't touched enough. And just the fact that, yeah, we might not be where we are with gaming and smartphones today. We might not have stuff like, Fortnite on our phones. We might not have Apple Arcade. We may not have all of these different types of mobile gaming if it weren't for something like the N-Gage. So I think it does deserve at least a little bit more of a touch of respect.
Absolutely. So the Nokia N-Gage, not a really good phone, not necessarily a great game console, but regardless of where it stands, it's highly influential. So, on that note, I think this is a good place to end off. G, would you like to go ahead and tell everyone where they can find you online?
Okay, sure. Well, you can find me at G to the next level. It's like the old Sega phrase, welcome to the next level, but with a G instead of welcome. And you can find me, of course, on YouTube, youtube.com/G to the next level. I do videos kind of similar to how you do, James. It's like I'll pick stuff that's either retro or modern, as I like to call it, retro gaming in the modern age. And I tend to put out videos at least like every 2 weeks, but you can mainly find me there. If you're into old school retro and Sega, that's a good place to start. And I'm also on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, all under the same name, G to the next level. I love talking with new people as far as like retro gaming, modern gaming, and everything in between.
Awesome. Seriously, he makes incredible content. Go check him out. And of course, I'm James. You can find me on Stuff We Play, home of everything weird and retro, on YouTube. And of course, right now, you're listening to Stuff We Say. So with that, thank you all very much for watching. Thank you, G, for joining me today. Everyone stay classy, and I'll see you next time.